Today, I'm speaking with Zach Weinersmith. Zach's the cartoonist behind Saturday Morning Breakfast Cereal and the co-author of several books, including Soonish, 10 Technologies That Will Improve and or Ruin Everything, and A City on Mars, Can We Settle Space? Should We Settle Space? And Have We Really Thought This Through?
A potted history of space exploration.
So let me give you a kind of like potted history up to now.
Perfect.
So one way to think about all this is it's only in like the late 19th century that it becomes clear you could even get to orbit, right? And that's because we've managed to liquefy these gases that are used as propellant. And, rockets had been around for centuries, but they're just kind of like a crappy military thing that's not as good as just like setting mortars throughout most of history. And then we hit this scientific like chemistry breakthrough. It's like, oh, you can do this. And there are like multiple founding fathers of different countries. And there's a kind of mania for space stuff. And it's mostly amateur stuff. It's like goofball cranks, like weird young men blowing themselves up in like parking lots. And then there's this kind of hinge point, which is for a variety of reasons. We go through it a little in the book. The Nazis put a lot of money into rockets. And in particular, they happen to have this guy named Wernher von Braun, who's a sort of, people can debate this, but I think generally considered a sort of genius, at least at management, possibly also at engineering, a kind of Elon Musk figure in that sense. He seems to be the like guy who can get things across the finish line. He invents this technology that is called the V-2 rocket. It's the basis for all initial rockets, both in the U.S. and the Soviet Union after the war. But it's still kind of a sleepy technology. But then ICBMs, nuclear missiles come up, and it suddenly is quite serious to have rockets. But no satellites until 1957 with Sputnik. And then everybody knows the story of this crazy space race. And there's a great quote I love about this. I think it was by Michel van Pelt, who's an ESA scientist. And he said something like, prior to Apollo 8, which if you remember is the one where 3 guys went around the moon and came back. Not that they landed. That was Apollo 11. Prior to Apollo 8, every estimate of the future of space was an underestimate. Nobody had expected it would happen so fast. But after Apollo 8, everything was an overestimate. So it's after about like 1970, that would be 1968, I think, people start having the zany space fantasies. And the reason they could reasonably think that is the price to put stuff in space. The numbers we have now say if you take from, say, 1957 to like 1970, the price drops by between 90 and 99%, right? It's an insane, super fast drop.
That is insane.
Right? But the problem is the reason for that is it's starting from a crazy high point, right? So very loosely speaking, it falls from something like $1 million a pound, or let's say kilogram. It's order of magnitude, so I can do that. Let's say it's about $1 million a kilogram, down to about, we used to always say $10,000, but then it stops. And in fact, it probably goes up a little bit after the Saturn V era with the moon landings. And the space shuttle, which was supposed to make space access cheap, regular, and safe, did none of those things, and possibly was like the most expensive ride to space for 40 years. And so if you want to see like depressing space literature, go to the 90s when like all the dreams are just super dead and everyone's trying to figure out some other path and nothing is there. And then in the 90s, late 90s, and then through Obama, we get these programs through NASA. And I really think this is the big change that basically say, in the past, we've done cost plus contracts with these companies, meaning like they deliver the rockets and then we pay them more money regardless of how much they cost to make them, which is, for obvious reasons, not the optimal way to do it. It's a kind of way to de-risk a risky business, but not a great way to save money. And so there are these programs looking for private suppliers, and into the fray steps this young billionaire or millionaire at the time, Elon Musk, who makes a huge bet on a company that is called SpaceX. And with a lot of luck, it almost goes off the rails. They manage to make a rocket that's like a clean sheet design. Like all old rockets pretty much are based on old military designs, which creates problems. This is a streamlined, simplified design. It uses a lot of off-the-shelf parts that only became possible because modern electronics are so good that you could just send stuff. A lot of NASA stuff is like made to order.
Right.
And so they made this much cheaper rocket. And so that's the first big cost drop when the Falcon comes along. That's Falcon 1. But then Falcon 9 really changes the game, right? I know we can all make fun of Elon Musk and this and that, but it's that you cannot doubt without this play by him and his company, You don't get the big change, I don't think. So starting at around 2015, the price starts dropping, especially when they add reusable rockets. If you don't know your space economics, like the big cost of launching a rocket to space is you destroy it afterwards, right? The fuel to get up is quite cheap by comparison, right? But because you destroy the machine, as with any transport system, if you destroyed the airplane or the bus when you got to your destination, the tickets would be expensive. So they are able to reuse part of the rocket. And since then, between mass manufacturing, at least by rocket standards, and reusability and just their streamlined design, costs have dropped precipitously in a way that wasn't true from 1970 to 2015. And so all those dreams from the early 70s are back. Some of them directly, like they're referencing the literature from the 70s, right? But I think the hype is really down to the change in cost, and it's real. And there's genuine hype. To give to my favorite example of this, like SpaceX, I haven't checked the number lately, but Starlink has some number of thousands of satellites. It's like over 3,000 now. I think prior to them starting to launch Starlink satellites, the total number ever was like 9,000. I don't think it'll be long before the majority of all satellites are Starlink satellites unless something changes. So it's a real change. Anyone trying to deny that there's a real revolution is just, I think it's like borderline conspiracy theory stuff. It's a real change.
Why space settlement probably won't make us rich.
There are a couple ways people talk about this. So one is space-based solar, right? So the classic argument is, well, you put a solar panel in space, there are different estimates, but let's say you get about 10 times more power per area. Then you beam that back, and by the way, it's also always on. There's no intermittency. The old joke, which I think goes back to the 70s, is that like the problem with Earth's solar is that there's a planet in the way. So it kind of superficially sounds plausible. And you can, I think that 10 times per area is kind of valuable because you say, okay, I have to, that's my constraint. I can't spend more than 10 times per panel if this is going to be worthwhile. And then you start thinking, well, so already you're really far in the hole just because of launch costs, right? So it's still something like $2,000 a kilogram, say. And I looked this up. I think a solar panel weighs like 20 kilograms. So you're already pretty far in the hole just putting the thing in place. And so, you have to ask yourself, what's the marginal cost of putting an extra panel up in, New Mexico or the Sahara or the Outback or wherever versus trying to put it in space somewhere. But then you add a lot of realism. So people have this idea that space is empty. It's not. It's quite empty compared to, your backyard, but it is still crisscrossed with radiation and little bits of debris, little rocks and dust and things that are moving at high speed often. So you're going to have people who maintain this stuff, and it's got to be extra tough. But the other thing, this is something that really does it for me. So people think space is cold, and in a physics sense, that's true. But actually, if you look at the International Space Station, a lot of what you're looking at, if you get an overhead view, is radiators radiating away heat. Why? Because you can't dump heat into the void. There's nothing, it's like the way my 9-year-old was asking about this. And the example I came up with was, if you're a blacksmith and you have a red hot piece of iron and you want to cool it off, what do you want to put in? Would you rather put it in the cold winter air or like lukewarm water? And I think intuitively the water, because you just have that density of stuff to take away heat. You don't have that in space. So you can only use electromagnetic radiation, right? So if you have a solar panel always facing into the sun, this is a thing you're going to have to deal with. And so it's just this ultra complex system that you have to maintain. And by the way, when you beam back power, you have to have a giant receiver. So you're not even off the hook for like taking up land area. It's not as big as solar on Earth, but it's still big. And so my theory around space-based solar, because if anyone at home wants to do a back of the envelope, you'll very quickly see it's a bad idea. I think it's a kind of zombie idea. It sort of made sense in the 70s when photovoltaics, like the cost of the panel itself was quite high, meaning you have to maximize per area. And it's just not true anymore. So I think it's just not good. Unfortunately, agency heads and VC people bring it up a lot. I just don't think if you just run some numbers on a piece of paper, you won't get even close.
Okay, so that's solar. What about other resources in space?
Another one is asteroid resources. So, maybe someday, and I would say sort of trivially, if you want to be like 10,000 years in the future when we're all on like a Dyson sphere, by all means. But if you're talking about any time soon, okay, the first thing to know is absolutely there's valuable stuff in the asteroid belt. There is, it's worth noting, a lot more valuable stuff just in the Earth, if we're allowed to say anything. Earth is very big. The question is what you can get at a profit. And I guess what I want to say is it's just really hard to get stuff from the belt. So the belt is far away. It's farther than Mars, which already takes 6 months to get to. You may have this idea from Star Wars that asteroids are kind of like big potatoes that you can just sort of grab, but actually they're generally rubble piles, these loose agglomerations of dust and stone. People seem to have this idea that there are like hunks of platinum or gold floating around, and there are not. There are asteroids that are high in what's called PGM, platinum group metals, like I think rhodium, platinum, obviously, I think iridium maybe, which are valuable, but they're not made of this stuff. They're just fairly high in it compared to Earth. So if you look at the ideal asteroids, which are asteroids that are going to come near Earth and kind of lock velocity with us so that we can go get them more easily, and which are high in PGM, it's on the order of like a dozen. There aren't many.
Whoa.
Right? And so, you start to add up all the stuff you have to successfully do to just get one of these, and then maybe you want to try to refine it in space, which is really hard because a lot of refining processes assume gravity. You can see why there are all these dead startups that didn't even get off the drawing board phase. It's just a really, really hard problem, especially when you compare it to just digging a hole on Earth. And then, last thing, and I'll be quick about this. Sometimes people will say there's going to be like a translunar mining economy, which is like all that stuff I just talked about is crazy. Like this is out crazying all of that. The usual argument is you'll get helium-3, which is an isotope of helium, which is valuable. But it's like really, we estimated to get an okay amount, you'd have to like strip mine miles of the lunar surface, which is, for reasons we'll get into, extraordinarily difficult. Michel Van Pelt, who I think I quoted earlier, said something like, if there were bars of gold on the surface of the moon, it would not be worth it to collect them. And the insight for me on that, if you think about Saturn V rockets, you're talking about a skyscraper-sized rocket, goes to space, drops off like a dinghy on the moon. Like by the time they get to the moon, it's like a scrap of dust from this giant skyscraper. And in all those missions, they brought back half a ton of rock, right? So what half-ton material can you just pick up that's going to repay the hundreds of billions of dollars? It's just not plausible. So, sorry, I don't buy it.
What happens to human bodies in space?
One, worth noting, just, almost anywhere in space, the moment you step outside your suit or ship, you die. Not non-trivial, right? And definitely in the places we are likely to go, that is true. And that's just the deal. And so to give it just a quick example of why space is a really fussy place to live. So like we talk about this, if you want to have spacesuits. So to me, this is like a fascinating detail. So spacesuits are kept at lower pressure than spacecraft. And the reason is it's hard to operate like a balloon inside, right, if it's at full pressure. So we keep it at lower pressure. It just makes it easier to bend and operate the suit. In order to do that, you have to up the oxygen concentration so your lungs can still get enough. And we don't like to do that in the craft because on both sides of the Cold War, there were tragedies related to pure oxygen environments. Most American audiences know Apollo 1, but in the Soviet Union, there was a very similar incident with a trainee named Bondarenko. And so it's a real problem. So if, like, the joke we have is like, if you're on your Mars hab and like your friend is dying outside the facility, you literally can't go save them.
Right.
Because if you put on your suit without pre-breathing oxygen for a while, you'll just get the bends like a diver surfacing too soon. So you'll just wriggle and die while your friend also dies. God. And actually the only three guys who've ever died in space were Soviet cosmonauts, Patsayev, Dobrovolsky, and Volkov, who all died due to a valve opening when they were moving toward descent, right? So it's not a little thing. Everything is going to be annoying, and so, but the next thing is radiation. Radiation is real bad. I won't go into the details, but the short version is that in space, you get higher doses of different kinds of radiation than you get down here, and with unknown consequences. Radiation is poorly understood even on Earth. It's even worse understood up there. The data we have mostly comes from space stations, which are still in the Van Allen belts. So they get more radiation than we get down here, but it's still different. We only have a tiny amount of data from the guys who got sent to the moon, and they weren't there for very long. It was like on the order of weeks total. And it's just, we don't know the effects of this stuff, and it's scary. Probably the main practical effect is you're going to have to bury your base under a lot of dirt. No glass domes for you. There's a bunch more detail, but it's in the book if people want. But then the big thing probably is microgravity. So in the International Space Station, you experience free fall, right, as if you're in zero gravity. And reliably, that degrades bones. So we know bones, especially like hip bones you don't use a lot, lose something like 1% of density per month.
That is crazy.
It's crazy. And that's with intense exercise, like 6 days a week on these, like they put you like on a treadmill with a spring to pull you into it, and you still have this loss. Similar effects on muscles. They degrade over time. It's considered very impressive. When you come home, you can walk. And there are other reasons for that, but one weird thing that happens in space is when you lose that gravity, you get a massive upward fluid shift. So you lose like 30% of the volume in your legs. Your face sort of just poofy like a baby. And they actually call it puffy face. It happens. The sort of sinister side of it is it's probably associated with this phenomenon where astronauts tend to come back with worse vision. And in fact, astronauts over 40 are sent up with what are called space anticipation goggles, assuming they'll come back with. And this happens even on short trips. Huh. As I recall, it's in our book. I think it's permanent, or at least semi-permanent. And so it's a problem. And what's mostly scary about that, it's not just, you can always get glasses, I guess, but like, it's possible that's actually an early sign of broader nerve damage. So there's equivocal evidence of cognitive negative effects on astronauts. We don't have enough data. A big thing underpinning all this is that we don't have anyone who's gone longer than 437 days. I think the next person down is about a year, and it's only like half a dozen people who've gone that long. Most people are much shorter. So we really don't have any kind of really long-term data. By the way, a Mars mission is on the order of 2 to 3 years.
Right.
The ethics of space babies.
Often when this comes up, it's like, well, can you have sex? Can you have babies? But in order to have a settlement, that babies have to develop through all the stages of human development to be adults who can have children. And that's where it gets really scary. So you describe all these medical things. Imagine applying them to a kid whose bones are developing, right? Whose vascular system is developing, brain is developing. We really have no idea. And so the scary thing is not that we can't get this data, it's that without this data, if we have Elon Musk is saying we'll be there in 30 years, no one is collecting this data. There's really haphazard experiments over time. There's not much agency funding. As far as I can tell, there's no funding from crazy billionaires. We need this data. It's going to be very painstaking to get, arguably unethical to get, because you at least have to experiment on like primates before you're willing to do it on human women. And it's hard to imagine how you could even get good data unethically in a matter of decades. Like, it should be a problem we're pursuing now if we're really serious about space.
Right.
Like, if tomorrow we found out Earth was going to be dead in 100 years, this would be part of the crash course, a big part of it. Uh-huh. And what also worries is that if you do execute on this settlement and you've got kids being born in these conditions where you would expect a higher than normal rate of abnormality, say kids with cognitive deficits, physical deficits, who have trouble contributing to this hostile environment where they can't get any care. On Earth, when you have special needs children, some of us would complain about government services not being quite adequate, but there are at least services. There are ways to take care of these human beings. And that wouldn't be true on any kind of medium-term Mars settlement. And what's scary is we found 3 different quotes from advocates in this community willing to say some version of, well, we'll just have to have natural selection do its thing,
God.
Right? Which you're like, holy crap, this is like a horror science fiction novel.
That really, really is horrifying.
They're just saying the quiet part out loud, though. This is what would happen if tomorrow you snapped your fingers and there were 1 million people on Mars. You would be doing a mass experiment on babies, the result of which would probably be a large number of children who couldn't be cared for. So, when we say we're concerned about space ethics, people are imagining we're going to be like, do you really want capitalism on the moon? And there are people who want to bark up that tree, but we're like, what we don't want is vast experiments on babies for no reason, which seems to be a reasonable ethical posture for anyone, anywhere, ever.
Making babies in space.
You said we can probably have sex in space. Is the hard thing gravity?
Gravity, I'm debating how graphic to get here. So it's funny. So one of the things we did for this book is we read a lot of old books forecasting the future of space. Uh-huh. And there's a sort of golden age of talking about sex in space, which is from somewhere like 1960 to 1980. And I think it was the right time. And so like Arthur C. Clarke, I don't remember if we put this in the book, but he had some quote that was like, space is about to become more erotic. And you're like, oh God, Arthur. So space is Newtonian. If you're in microgravity, it'd be easier on the moon. But so basically that means if someone bumps into somebody else, they both go flying.
Right. Okay.
And so from this period, there were attempts to figure out how to manage that. So we found two different proposals for what one guy called an unchastity belt, which is a sort of elastic waistband for two. And it's funny when you hear that and you're like, okay. And then you think, but wait. How exactly? And then you're like, maybe I'm just not gonna. And then there's another one called the snuggle tunnel. I forget who proposed that, but it was basically imagine a large pipe with holes in it for ventilation because CO2 tends to build up near mouths if there's not ventilation.
God. Okay.
And I could go on, but
I would argue that space did not get more erotic.
No, it has not gotten more erotic. The dream of Clark has died. Earth netting space notoriously kind of smells bad, and and by the way, you change undies every something like 4 to 7 days, so it's just not the mood lighting is not present. There's not a lot of private space. When I say it probably could happen, basically I'm referring to anecdotal reports from men who said they were up for it. We found two men admitting to space onesomes.
Okay.
So that's what I mean by that.
Yep.
So whether you could actually bring the baby to term, I mean, who knows? So I say, human body is not designed for zero gravity, but it is. You could note, this is kind of goofy. We looked up does anyone do headstands while pregnant? And apparently this comes up in yoga, and it's okay. And so they can, apparently fetuses can do -1 gravity. I mean, they are kind of in a neutral buoyancy tank, and so maybe it's fine. I'd be more worried about some sort of cellular level process that depends on gravity in some way or another that we're not thinking about. But it is the case evolution would at least design it so a woman could trip and fall and the fetus would be okay. So clearly you can alter the sort of acceleration that's being put on the fetus, to say it in a weird way.
Yeah. At least temporarily, and baby's fine. Yep. Okay.
Yeah. So that's why I say it seems plausible that the baby might be able to come to term unless something we don't know is happening.
Yep.
There are also little other off ramps. So the environment in a space station is very different. I'm sorry, the atmosphere is very different from what we get on Earth. So they tolerate a much higher level of CO2 because they have to. It'd be very expensive and mass consuming to have a bunch of CO2 scrubbing going on. Ideally on a Mars base, you'd have a lush ecosystem to manage that, which is a tall order. And there's other stuff. So you imagine if you open, you get a package from Amazon, you open it, you often smell factory gases, and you don't care because they go out the door. In a space station, they actually have to check stuff for outgassing because it can stay in the system. And so you have to be really careful about this stuff. So, a plausible scenario is you might have, say, a high rate of spontaneous abortion for unknown reasons.
Ooh, yep.
I could go on, but there's just a lot of stuff that we don't know about. Yeah.
A roadmap for settling space.
If you were in charge of Operation Settle Space, what would the roadmap that you'd advocate for look like?
Yeah, so our roadmap, this is how we close out the book, which is we say, with all the naysaying we're doing, if you put us two in charge of a NASA level of funding for an agency oriented around putting a permanent settlement on Mars, the three big tracks for us. So one thing I would say, we're making an assumption, which is that the rocket tech will continue improving because they're basically, I was skeptical of a bunch of it, economic stuff, but orbital stuff below geosynchronous and below, extremely valuable for data transmission, remote sensing, navigation, all sorts of stuff. No doubt, big money. So I'm just going to assume the rockets and spacecraft just keep getting better. Mm-hmm. And so rather what we focus on, one is the reproductive question we've already gone through in detail, but you'd want some kind of experiment that basically goes up the phylogenetic chart from simple organisms to humans. Again, that is still kind of ethically questionable, but let's just say you had to do it. That would be the way you'd want to do it. Two, you would want to design these closed loop ecosystems, proof them out. That means building a lot of them, trying to find the minimal size, the optimal blend of species, and making sure they can last indefinitely. Optimal blend meaning produces a lot of calories in clean water and air. And then you would want to take those 2 tracks ideally and converge them on the moon. So if you really wanted to prove we could do Mars, you would want to build a pocket somewhere on the moon, maybe in the lava tubes, which is something we didn't get into, where you would have one of these greenhouse systems that's sealed and where you have animal organisms. Maybe show that, goats can have baby goats. Mm-hmm. And, like I said, I'm still sort of ethically like, gosh, given that there's no obvious short-term reason to do this, is it ever ethical to do this for human children? But we can set that aside. This is what you'd want to do if you had to. And then the third track is something we'll get into, I guess, in the second half of this, which is right now we have a really sort of bizarre legal international order in our approach towards space sovereignty. And that can be changed. This is all human culture stuff. And we know from the history of how the sea has been managed that, the scribblings of a philosopher in one age become the law of the earth in another. And so right now, and without getting into the details, which I think we'll get into later, we have a system that is kind of conflict prone in that it allows no sovereignty claims, no sort of territorial claims, but does allow, depending on your interpretation, ad libitum claims of resources. And so you would want, if you were setting up an agency to proof this out, you would want one oriented around governance, both to try to think about and maybe even try to implement an optimal international legal framework, and then perhaps even harder, determine the least bad way to govern a small initial outpost under these extraordinarily difficult conditions.